Good evening, Shirley Grossman. It's a pleasure to have you on Deep Dive. Shelby Grossman is a research scholar at Stanford. She was previously an assistant professor of political science at University of Memphis. She has a really interesting new book called The Politics of Order in Informal Markets, How States Shape Private Governance. Shelby, pleasure to have you on Deep Dive.
Thanks for having me.
Let me start by asking you, because one thing that fascinated me with your work was your observation of the Lebanese communities in West Africa, and particularly in Nigeria, even though you were unable to get any meaningful information from them. But I'm wondering if after close observation, there was something that you could point out to that was the reason for their enormous success in West Africa and in Nigeria in particular. Is it in the way they conduct their business in secret, or what is it about them that makes them incredibly successful in West Africa?
Yeah, so the Lebanese communities in West Africa are what political scientists would call an ethnic minority trading group. So in some ways, they're similar to like Asian communities in Uganda and other parts of East Africa. And I would say they, are sometimes successful, though sometimes they actually experience really negative outcomes. So, for example, the Asians in Uganda were expelled a few decades ago. So, sometimes they have economic success, but they also, face a lot of political risk for various reasons. So the thing that I was really interested in when it came to the Lebanese communities was that in some places in West Africa, the Lebanese were like really good at policing the behavior of other Lebanese. So, for example, I worked in Liberia for a year, and in Monrovia, the capital of Liberia, the Lebanese community was really cohesive. And if one Lebanese person did something that, like broke a law or something, like the Lebanese community itself would punish that person. But then I also spent some time in Abidjan in Cote d'Ivoire, and there were actually two very distinct Lebanese communities based on when they had arrived in the country. And they were not that cohesive. They had like this very real kind of divide. And so I was kind of interested in understanding, what explains, under what conditions do Lebanese communities have these divisions and how does it matter? And so I was trying to look into this in Kano, but as you noted, I didn't have a ton of success.
Yeah, I mean, talking about this cohesive nature of the Lebanese, which is obviously some sort of private governance there, which is at the heart of your work with informal markets in Nigeria. Is there a reason, first of all, why there's a lot of these cohesive nature of business communities, especially in Africa, as against the individualistic culture that you would see in the United States in terms of businesses? What is the striking difference? Why do businesses have to work collectively in places like West Africa rather than pursuing the individualistic nature of what you have in Western Europe or America?
Yeah, so I actually think the Lebanese are not that unique. So to give like a stupid example, right now I'm in America, and if a American person walked past me, I wouldn't like feel like I had a super strong connection to them because I'm surrounded by lots of other Americans. But when I'm in Nigeria and I see an American, I'm like, oh my gosh, hi, I'm Shelby. Where in America are you from? So I think kind of when you're a minority somewhere, you just like feel a connection to kind of similar people. So I think that's part of what's going on. But I do think, I guess, to some extent, the Lebanese are a little different. So I think in parts of West Africa, for example, it can be really difficult to get like loans from the bank. And so by having like a tight knit community where people will help out each other, and you can get a loan from another Lebanese business person, and they trust that you will repay because you're embedded in this very tiny community. And if you don't repay, you'll be sanctioned in all sorts of ways. Like when you go to that party with all the other Lebanese people on Friday, people are going to ostracize you. So I do think there's kind of that aspect of it as well.
All right, so let's talk about Nigerian businesses here, because you decided to switch to starting the informal businesses in Nigeria after having some hard luck with the Lebanese. But you also quickly found out that the Nigerians were a bit as secretive, if not even more secretive than the Lebanese. And you explained that the reason for this secrecy and what made it difficult for you to get data from these traders was the fact that they had been exploited in the past by people who came into their markets and got trade information and essentially used it against them. Give us a bit of background to that, to explain a bit of why, this trading communities are a bit insular and a bit secretive.
Yeah, so there are kind of two things going on here. So one is that they're secretive with each other. So traders are secretive with each other. And then the other is that they're secretive with outsiders. And I think there are two different explanations. So first, let's start with, why are traders within a market, so secretive with each other? And the simple answer is, quite obvious. It's just that they're in competition with each other. But I think it's not something that people always think about. So, when I first spent time in Nigeria and I would see like a vegetable market where like lots of women were selling tomatoes. Are you still here?
I'm here, yeah.
Okay, sorry. And I would see lots of women selling tomatoes. I would think, oh, surely they're all best friends with each other and are just, constantly like talking about their business experiences with each other. But often that's just not the case. They're competing with each other. They are, competing for customers with each other. And so as a result, if a customer buys something from them on credit and does not repay, they might not want to tell their neighboring trader about that experience, because maybe they want their neighboring trader to also get cheated by that customer, because again, they're in competition with each other. We see this with suppliers as well. Traders will get cheated by an overseas supplier in like China or something, and they won't want to tell anyone because again, they're in competition, and maybe they want their neighbor to get screwed over by that same supplier. And this is a phenomenon that's everywhere. It's not just Nigeria. So that's on like the within market secrecy. But then there's this, what you alluded to, this kind of secrecy toward outsiders. And, on the one hand, spending time in these markets was really fun because not that many like Western researchers are trekking around these markets. And so people weren't sick and tired of talking to people like me. But on the other hand, it was quite difficult because I heard many stories about how people who were not Nigerian and who were in business would come to the markets with a Nigerian fixer, and they would say, "Hi, I'm an academic researcher. Can you just tell me about your business? It's just for academic research." And then the fixer would come back to the market the next day and say, "Hey guys, I just want to let you know that guy was lying. He's actually in business. He's trying to get into the mobile phone business, and he was, which is what you guys are in, and he was just, lying when he said he was an academic." So those experiences, traders have had those experiences. They're very real in their minds. And so there's a lot of distrust when I'm like, "Oh, I'm an academic." And they're like, "Well, that Chinese guy also said he was an academic. So, how can we trust you?"
You talk about one of the reasons for private governance in many of these markets and why they are so closely knit together, bonding and forming these associations across many of these markets. And you argue that it's largely because of government intrusion. Sort of government meddling with the affairs of these markets and these business people. Is that first because you seem to make the argument in some sort of a good way that this helps some sort of private governance to thrive in these markets and helps them do better? Explain how that ends up being a good thing, that government intrusion is nudging them towards putting some sort of real what corporate people will call corporate governance here.
Yeah. So the outcome I'm trying to explain here is why sometimes market leaders do all these things that are really good for their traders. So sometimes market leaders will share information about like dubious suppliers to avoid. They will, coordinate trash collection and security and those sorts of things. And then other times you have market leaders who are actually extorting from their own traders and acting only in their kind of personal self-interest. So I'm trying to understand, when do you get one versus the other? And as you just said, my argument is that kind of counterintuitively, state threats can actually be good for a market. So, I know in Nigeria, like local governments, they have such a reputation for being like really corrupt. And so you might think, well, why is more local government intervention like good for a market? And what I saw happening is that when you have this threat from the government, it like brings traders together, and it actually motivates the market leader to do things that are good for the traders. So for example, if the market leader is extorting from his own traders, and a local government politician is trying to increase rates or whatever, it's going to be really hard for the market leader to mobilize the traders to protest against the politician. However, if the market leader has been kind of representing the interests of the traders will happily shut down their market for the day and go and protest. Another kind of mechanism is that when you have kind of interfering like government agency, you kind of want to keep your house in order, because when there are disputes in the market, that provides opportunities for like rent-seeking public officials to come and interfere. So I saw this happen a bunch of times where like I would be in Computer Village, and I actually don't even know if Computer Village is still around. I heard it might have been demolished, but oh yeah,
Still
but I
around,
would
still around.
still around. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
I'd be in Computer Village, and there'd be some sort of complicated dispute, and all of a sudden the police would show up. No one in the market wants the police to show up. Surely you're going to have to pay fees to them. The presence of the mobile police is going to scare customers away. And so it's in the face of that kind of interfering state that the market's going to want to keep its house in order. So that's kind of the reason for why like interfering government can be good for the market.
So what do you think happens the moment government has this hands-off approach, and it's less intrusive, and it's not meddling in the affairs of these markets? What do you think would happen to these this private governance that we see across these informal markets?
I think one of two things can happen. So first, you can have a market leader who extorts from their own traders, who doesn't respect the leases that traders have on their shops, and maybe kicks them out of their shop before the lease has expired. So that's like the worst thing that can happen. And it does happen. I've been to markets where that's happening. Another possibility is that you can have market leaders that aren't necessarily that predatory, but they're just not doing all that much. So maybe you get a market leader that just isn't really around the market that much and doesn't feel like they need to be around the market because there isn't really that state threat. So I think those are kind of two possible outcomes.
Something just popped up in my mind now talking about this, because before I go to the next question, I just wanted to quickly put this out there. As we speak today, I think there's a court judgment in Nigeria that gives the CBN the right to shut down the accounts of certain fintech companies like Rivest, Bamboo, who have been doing phenomenally well, because you have a bunch of Nigerians. Companies like Rivest created an opportunity for young Nigerians to invest, in stock outside the shores of the country, giving them better opportunities towards investments that are a lot more stable as against the volatility of our macroeconomic environment. But they've gotten a court judgment that essentially stops their operations, albeit temporarily. And I'm wondering, because these tech communities in Nigeria do not have the kind of private governance that the informal markets do have. And do you think that to guard against such high-handed approach from the regulators, these tech communities, and of course some businesses in the private sector, will have to organize themselves in the way these informal markets seem to have successfully organized themselves?
Yeah, you could definitely imagine how like a union or an association for, the different like tech companies and Yaba or something, you could imagine how that would be like really useful. It's going to be a little more difficult than it is for the market traders, though. And the reason is that those companies are bigger often, and they might feel like they don't need an association, that they have their own lobbyists, they have their own people in Abuja, and why are they going to commit resources to help out like this other kind of smaller tech company or something like that. Whereas for these market traders, like you're just one trader, you have a very small shop, probably you don't have any employees. there's no way you can negotiate with the state on your own. You need this association. So all that's to say, just that it's trickier. But if it were to exist, I think that could be really useful.
All right. I mean, so you talk about the fact that private governance. I mean, going back to the informal markets here, you talk about the fact that once the markets are situated on lands that are owned by the local government, they seem to do a lot better as against when the lands are located on private land. Explain to me why that is the thing, how it is possible that these markets or the governance in these markets tend to thrive better when they are in the lands of local governments, where these local government officials have access to exploit them whenever, as against when it's on private sector land, when the owners, as long as you've paid your rents and or your fees or your levies, they let you do whatever you want until it's the next year to pay rent.
Yeah, so I was personally shocked by this finding because, before running this survey, I had spent like a year just in the markets, like talking to traders, and traders just complained over and over and over again about the local government. Like, I don't know if I ever heard a positive story about a local government and these markets. And so I, certainly expected things to be better in the markets that were on private land. And that just wasn't the case. I will say what I'm talking about when I say better is exactly what you just said, better private governance. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're making more money or anything like that. And in fact, based on the data I have, they're not making more money. So they're making the same amount of money. So all I'm saying is that the private governance is better. And I think it's for the same reasons that we were just talking about, that when you're on local government land, you just face more threats. The local government, in addition to collecting all the fees that they collect from all traders, like the, TV, radio fee, those sorts of things, they also are collecting rent, and they just have kind of more rights to kind of come in and hassle you if you're on public government land. And so it's because of that threat that I think the market leaders are, less likely to extort from their traders, because if they do, they can't push back against these politicians.
Interesting. You also talk about regime types and the nature of the threats that actually inform, the quality of private governance in these markets and how they respond, in terms of organizing themselves. What kind of threats or what kind of regimes have you observed that have produced the best outcomes in terms of private governance? What kind of regimes, usually get the best out of these associations or, or trading groups?
Yeah, so my research is really primarily on Lagos. So to that extent, I can't totally say much about how regime type would matter because, we're just in Lagos. But I kind of speculate at the end of the book about whether the argument might hold in other regimes. And this chapter was kind of informed by some time that I spent in Equatorial Guinea, which is a really authoritarian, repressive state. And I was in Malabo, which is the kind of island capital of Equatorial Guinea. And I was like, oh, I want to see some markets here, see if they're like the markets in Nigeria. And I found some markets. In fact, it was mostly Nigerians who are traders in these Equatorial Guinea markets. And I was just talking to them. And, first of all, I could barely talk to them. They were so terrified to be speaking to me because, they were just afraid somehow they would get in trouble with like the government. And it just made me think like, there's no way my argument would apply in a place like Equatorial Guinea. Like you can't really in a meaningful way negotiate with like local politicians in like such an authoritarian state. Like, the power that market traders have is the power of their vote, that they can threaten to, vote in mass for a different candidate, or they could threaten to like protest at the governor's mansion or something like that. You can't do that in Equatorial Guinea. So that's why I think the argument might not hold in like really repressive states.
I mean, you just raised an important point that I wanted to take you up on, going forward, which is the fact that the recognition or the relationship between these informal markets and the local government is a relationship that is underpinned by their political leanings. And so usually it's usually a trade-off or some sort of a bargain between the markets and the politicians, which is vote for me and you get this, or vote for me and you don't get that. So in your observation, is this kind of politics really good for the business communities in Lagos, where you observed um, setting informal businesses, and how can the politics, and should the politics change, how would that really affect these businesses in these communities?
I think it kind of depends on what kind of local government chairman you have. So across the 57 local governments in Lagos, in my head, there are kind of like two different types of chairmen. This is an exaggeration. It's not this simple, but this is kind of how I think about it. On the one hand, there are chairmen who maybe come from one of like the traditional families in the community, and maybe they're kind of older, and they're just kind of like happy to have the position, and they don't really need to rock the boat that much. They're just gonna kind of do the basic things they need to do. You have that kind of chairman. Then you have a different kind of chairman who is much younger, maybe comes from civil society and has super high career ambitions. Like they want to become they want to work for the Lagos state government one day or something like that. And if you have that kind of chairman, it could go one of two ways. Like sometimes I saw things working out kind of reasonably well for the markets that were politically powerful. So for example, maybe you have a local government chairman that wants to renovate a market, right? Because that's going to make the chairman look good in front of the governor. You have this kind of falling apart market, you're going to renovate it, make it a modern market. That's sometimes not super awesome for the traders because they might be priced out of shops in the renovated market, and also they're going to be displaced for like months at a time. But I saw one amazing situation where a powerful market association negotiated with the local government chairman and was like, hey, we're going to let you do this, but if you don't want us to make a big fuss about it, you need to give us a temporary space in the back of the market so that while it's undergoing renovation, we can still be selling. And when the market is fully renovated, we want there to be some affordable shops so that we can stay here. And it worked out. Like I went, and that was like what happened. So sometimes, it can kind of like work out that way, but other times, other times it just doesn't. Like maybe the local government chairman doesn't believe that the market association is really going to protest, so they don't feel the need to accommodate their demands. Yeah.
I mean, so in the overarching argument that you make, I'm trying to look for where this entire research now points towards. I understand the fact that you make a very important point of the rise of these private governance in many of these markets, even though on the one hand you realize that government has a policy of wanting to ban these informal markets, or at least nudge them towards formalizing their operations. So do you see in the long term that these markets will continue to operate on the fringes without necessarily, because what happens at the end of the day is, because if they are not totally formalized, they deny the state government revenues in terms of taxation and all of that. Even though the local governments still have a way of collecting these levies and all of that. So do you see a long-term struggle between local governments and state governments in terms of formalizing the operations of many of those who operate in the informal sector, so that can at least boost the revenue of the state governments? Or do you envisage a situation where these markets would have to be now protected by local governments who ultimately benefit from them directly?
Yeah, it's an important question. I mean, so I think the way like most economies develop is that the traders who are like the traders who I studied, they just grow their businesses, right? So they're no longer selling out of a little shop, they're selling out of a bigger shop, and they have paid full-time employees. And as you get bigger, there are just naturally like more incentives to formalize yourself, because maybe you're now in a position where your little shop that's selling stationery, you could provide a contract to the Lagos state government where you're, selling them stationery in bulk. And you can't do that if you're not completely formalized. Like all your documents have to be in order, obviously, for you to have like a contract with the state government. And so that just isn't really happening in Lagos, or maybe it is, but it's just happening slowly. So I think the question is like kind of under what conditions will these traders be able to grow their businesses? And I think, one of the things that's really fascinating about these traders, and this is from my colleague Meredith Start's research, so many of these traders import directly from overseas suppliers. And not only that, they actually travel abroad when they're importing. I mean, I'm sure you know this, but I think it's kind of surprising to non-Nigerians sometimes, how many of these traders who are, small businesses, no employees, and still they themselves are traveling to China to, buy from these suppliers. And what we've seen happen with COVID is it's really affected their ability to import. So we've actually, the traders who I surveyed for this book, we've surveyed them 4 times since we've developed relationships with them. And so we've been able to see how COVID has affected their businesses. And it's just been really devastating because they don't feel confident importing when they can't kind of go to the supplier and actually check out the products in person. So I think COVID has kind of been a setback for many reasons. But I think kind of the question here is under what conditions will these traders grow their businesses? And I think there are lots of solutions, making it easier to get loans, particularly if you're not, totally formal, those sorts of interventions as well.
So finally, before I let you go, what are the good signs or the bad signs, that you have, picked up in your research in terms of informal markets in Nigeria? What are the good prospects and what are the bad prospects, and how do we deal with those terrible prospects going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that I just find so incredible about traders in Lagos, and I hope this doesn't sound cliche, but is just how willing they are to take risks. I've heard the craziest stories from these traders, oh, I went to a travel agent to buy a plane ticket to China. I'd been saving up for 6 months to get a plane ticket to China. I got the plane ticket, I got on the plane, and I ended up in the wrong city in China. And I had lost all my money because the businesses I wanted to buy from weren't there. And so I just had to come home and I lost everything and I had to start saving up again. And I heard that story and I was just like, if that happened to me, I'd be out of business. I'd just be like, I'm done. I'm going to take an office job. I don't care if it pays less, that would be the most frustrating thing that had ever happened to me in my life. And I heard stories like that so many times, and traders are just like, yep, that's what happens. And now I'm just going to start saving up again. And I think that's incredible. And, it's incredible to have a country that has people with that kind of attitude, and that has to be good for the long-term output of the economy. I think, for these traders to really thrive, governance is what matters. Governance at the federal level, governance at the state level, governance at the local government level. And yeah, I think that's the thing to kind of keep one's eye on.
I mean, it's a fascinating way to end the conversation. Shelly Grossman, thank you so much for joining us on this conversation. Thank you for the important work you did on markets in Nigeria. And I hope your book has a very successful outing. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ayodele. Nice chatting with you.
All right, then. Have a great day.